All right, we're ready to start. Welcome. My name is Phil Thompson. I direct the Aquinas Center of Theology here at Emory University, and on behalf of the Candler School of Theology and the Aquinas Center, the co-sponsors of this event, we are very happy to have you here tonight. And I can tell you, having spent just over a day with Bryan Hehir, that you're in for a treat. I don't know how much you know about Father Bryan Hehir, but my comment to him was, you've done everything in the Catholic Church except be Pope. He has, yeah, that's right, there's still time. But he has, let's see, I'm just going to give you a little bit because we'd be here all night. I've had to go through his entire resume. They said of James Brown, the entertainer, he's the hardest working man in show business. Father Hehir is the hardest working man in the Catholic Church. He has been president of Catholic Charities. He's taught at Georgetown and Harvard for many years. His current position is he's in the Kennedy School of Government and helping the Cardinal with the social services of Boston, overseeing a number of them, and working in a parish. And I don't know, he's probably got something else he's doing as well. I mean, it is an amazing thing to see how much he does and how much he has given to the church. He's also won a number of distinguished awards, including the Laetare Medal at Notre Dame. And if you know about the Laetare Medal, that's the highest, I would say the highest award any Catholic can receive in this country for his service to the church. I just want to make sure I didn't leave anything out that's very critical here. I think that covers it. Oh, and why I forgot to leave out, he was also a key person on the U.S. Catholic Conference in developing their public policy in the 1980s and 1990s, including the letter on nuclear disarmament, which some of you may remember. So with that, we need to get going because Father Hehir, believe it or not, once he leaves here, if you see him streak up the stairs here to the getting out of here, he's going to catch a plane. It's not because he didn't like you. It's because he's got to catch a plane and go back to Boston. He's talking on something like, is it Iran and nuclear war? Tomorrow, some light topic like that. So we were very thankful to have him here to talk about Pope Francis. This is the year of the Pope Francis effect for us, and we're very excited about our lineup both in the fall but also more to come, and we'll talk about a little bit about that after Father Hehir departs. But right now, let's welcome him and be very thankful that he's here tonight. Bryan.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Thompson and thank the Aquinas Institute, Candler School of Theology, and Emory University for the invitation to be part of this quite remarkable schedule of lectures on the Francis effect. It's really an honor to be part of this series and to be tested on and to be listed on a range of speakers who have preceded me in this lectureship in past years, and others who will follow this year. Professor Thompson gave a very expansive discussion of my life. I've been on the lecture series for 50 years, and no matter how generous the introduction is, like tonight, there's always a part that gets left out. And that is, for years I worked in Washington at the Bishops' Conference, and if you work in Washington in a staff job, you write speeches that other people gave. And a lot of us used to gather periodically to discuss. A lot of us who did that for a living used to talk about what the vocation was like to spend your life writing speeches that other people gave. I had a friend who wrote for a senator from the Midwest, not the South, came from the Midwest, and the senator not only never thanked him once for a speech, the senator never read a speech before he gave it. So my friend decided after 5 years of this that he was fed up. And so it was during an election year. The senator was up for election. He came into the office on a Friday afternoon, picked the speech up off the desk, headed for the airport, stepped into a room like this with twice as many people, and he began the speech. He said, ladies and gentlemen, this was in the middle of the Cold War. He said, ladies and gentlemen, I know you have declining faith in government. I know you think we can neither be efficient nor effective. I'm here tonight to tell you we can be both, efficient and effective. I'm here to tell you that we can hold down the arms race and not sacrifice the security of the country. We can make new friends among the Arab states and not sacrifice our relationship with Israel. We can hold down unemployment and not do it at the price of rising inflation. My task tonight is to tell you exactly how government can do this for you. Turn to page 2, and at the top of page 2 it said, "Good luck, buddy, you're on your own." So that's life inside the Beltway, and I was there for 22 years. So again, my appreciation for the opportunity to give this lecture. When I understood that this is going to be a series of lectures throughout the rest of the semester, I thought what I would do is to draw a broad framework around the lecture series and to look at Francis's impact inside the church and in the world. So I inevitably will touch on topics that others will deal with in more detail, and I suspect with greater insight. So I'll tell you what I am going to do. First, I want to look at what I'll call the sources of Francis's vision, where it comes from, and at the same time, describe what I believe is what I'll call the Francis Project. Secondly, I'll then try to look at Francis's work within the church, and then thirdly, turn to the question of Francis and the world. So where does Francis draw from in his life? I think there are 4 things, at least as I see them, that you can demonstrably see their effect in his ministry. First of all, he's a Jesuit, and although now a bishop, he remains a Jesuit. And you get a feel for that. When he wrote his first major encyclical, it was a pastoral exhortation called The Joy of the Gospel. When he went to analyze the world, my colleagues at Kennedy School will call it analyzing the world. He didn't say that. He said we ought to look at the world and discern what we see. Classical Jesuit language. We ought to discern what we see. So he's a Jesuit, and that comes through. If you've noticed, the last 2 Christmases, he's been fairly critical of the chorial staff and told them at Christmas time what their failings were and what they needed to reform. He sounded like a good Jesuit spiritual director, talking to a lot of young Jesuits when he was talking to the chorial. So that's the first, the Jesuit. Secondly, he's a Latin American bishop, and that does shape, I think, a number of things that he sees. Thirdly, he's a Vatican II bishop. Not that he was at the council, but that he was ordained when the council was already in place and at work in the church. And finally, people who know him well and have tracked his career closely always stress that there was a decisive impact on his life when he became Archbishop and his living contact with the poor of his archdiocese. So a Latin American bishop, a Jesuit bishop, a Vatican II bishop, and a bishop whose contact with the poor shapes a good deal of his life. Now, if those are the sources of his vision, I still think it's useful to draw things together by talking about what I'll call the Francis Project. And what do I mean by that? I think Francis is an authentically charismatic person and personality. Now, there are different meanings of charismatic. There's a theological meaning of charismatic that we've used in the church for ages. The theological meaning of charismatic is it's a grace given to a person not for themselves, but for what they can do for others. A kind of special gift of the Holy Spirit. So it is, in Latin, they call it gratia gratis data, a gift freely given so that you can enhance the life of the church and the world. Secondly, there's a second meaning of charismatic that comes from the famous German social scientist Max Weber. Weber talked about styles of leadership, and one of the styles of leadership was charismatic leadership, as opposed to leadership by which you're installed by law or constitution or tradition. So theological charismatic, a grace given to enhance your work. Social science meaning of charismatic is a unique figure who leads precisely because of the character of their personality. Now, there's a third meaning of charismatic that doesn't help us. It's the meaning that comes in the media. So when you're in an election year, the U.S. press would let you think that there are about 100 charismatic figures in the country waiting to be elected. And that just means that they don't understand the meaning of charismatic. Francis is charismatic in the theological sense and in the social science sense. So my point about the Francis Project is, though, is that although he is a deeply charismatic person, drawing attention to his personality, which has happened all over the world, is not what he's about. The Francis Project is that he seeks to shape a church, not just his personality, not just his legacy. Francis is trying to shape the church he leads, a lasting legacy. He wants to shape a community of faith which has the capacity to demonstrate how faith can change the world. He said in the letter, The Joy of the Gospel, he said, the church should, quote, make history. He said, we should not be spectators of history. We should be the kind of church that makes history. And if you try to summarize what he means by that, I think what Francis wants to shape is a church that is marked by pursuit of justice in the world and mercy in the church. Justice in the world, mercy in the church. That is the kind of church that he, I think, is about and trying to shape. Now, how does he do this? What are the elements of his Francis Project of leadership? Well, if you try and assess Francis, I think you have to know how to work to combine words and deeds. Or to put it another way, how to combine symbolic action and the substance behind the symbolic action. France is a man who has an instinctively symbolic set of instincts. He instinctively reaches out with symbolic actions. So he's moving through a regular audience and he sees this man whose face is so disfigured that the man later said the mothers in his town told the children never go near him. His face was totally disfigured. Francis stopped the Pope mobile, got out and hugged him. He went to a meeting at Assisi in which there was huge gathering waiting for him. And he was supposed to go into a hospital room where there were 100 children with all kinds of disabilities. And he was supposed to give them the papal blessing and then move on to be on time for the meeting. He walked into that room and he saw those children and he greeted every single one of them, the 100, one by one by one. Instinctive symbolic action. We need to ask what is the substance behind his symbolic action. He's done other symbolic things. He doesn't live in the apostolic parish. He's reduced the sort of grandeur of some of the liturgy. He drives in a Ford Focus rather than a limousine. All kind of practical things. But behind it is a hint for the church. We want to be a simple church in a consumerist culture. We want to be Christians that have a sense of proportion. It's not that there's no car. It's not that there's no outfit to dress in. It's just a sense of proportion. Behind the symbolic action lies substantive commitment to issues. Final kind of symbolic substantive. Every executive knows that he or she has the most precious element in their life, how they spend their time. How they spend their time is the test of good executive planning. Have to look at how Francis spent his time. Immediately after he was named Pope, within a couple of months, his first trip outside Rome was to Lampedusa, this island between northern Africa and Italy, where the refugees are stranded after they risked their lives in order to get there. He went to Lampedusa to say something about a theme I'll mention later, the immigration theme. He then came home and he goes to the Jesuit Refugee Center. This is at a time when Europe and the United States are saying in so many words, we're fed up with immigrants. Well, the Pope of this church went to Lampedusa. Then he went to the Jesuit Refugee Center. Then he accompanied Patriarch Bartholomew from the Greek Orthodox Church again to one of the islands off the coast of Italy, his second visit to the immigrants. So these are instinctively designed actions, but behind the symbolism is substance. Behind the charisma is the project of shaping a church that is in pursuit of justice in the world and mercy in the church. So let's turn to how he has addressed the internal life of the church. During the Second Vatican Council, when the bishops were faced with this enormous agenda in their first session, the council was kind of drifting because they couldn't handle all the issues that were on their desk. And so it was Cardinal Montini, who eventually became Paul VI. Cardinal Montini, who was an intellectual by background and training, went to Pope John and said, we need to organize the council with simplicity. We need to look at the church ad intra in Latin, the church internally, and then we need to look at the church ad extra, how the church relates to the world. And that's the division of the council, and then we can begin to put things in order. Essentially, that's what I'm doing with explaining the Francis Project. What he's done internally, and my view of it will be selective, because I got to get the plane and you've got to go home and go to bed. So what he's done internally, and then what he has done in the church in the world. What he's done internally. Take what the council called the Doctrine of Collegiality. Fancy name. What it really means is that it isn't only the Pope that leads the church. The Pope leads the church along with the College of Bishops around the world. So it's a more collegial style of leadership. Now, the council's assertion of that, and what they were really saying is, look back at the 12 apostles. It isn't just Peter who leads the church, it's the 12 apostles together. Now, that was a teaching of the council. But in a complex institution like the church, you can say something, but then how do you put it into practice? So sometimes you run into a paradox. Coming out of the council, or after the council, John Paul II became the Pope. He constantly stressed that the church should act collegially. But John Paul II, by his instincts, was perhaps the most centralizing Pope in the last 1,000 years. And so by instinct, he wanted to be collegial, but by instinct, he, in a sense, centralized power in the church. When Francis was elected Pope, the discussion that had gone on ahead of time, which they always have before the final gathering and vote, the discussion was collegiality needs to be part and parcel of what we're about. Francis is committed to this theme. It's a theme that shapes the internal structure of the church. Francis returns to this theme with a collegial style of leadership. Not only the words, but a collegial style. And one of the most visible indications of this was the famous synod that was held on the family. So again, the council had declared that there should be a kind of continuation of the conversation of the council, that there should be a, quote, synod of bishops from around the world every 2, 3, 4 years to continue the conversation of the council. Francis, because of his commitment to collegiality, was not happy, as many bishops were not happy, with the way the synod had developed. Paul VI tried. John Paul II had, again, a strong centralizing vision. People used to think the synod was kind of a rubber stamp. Francis was determined to go back to the original idea of the synod. So what he did was to hold two synods on the same topic. An initial synod that sort of set the agenda, and next year you came back for the real synod. That synod has produced a lot of debate. You've probably heard of this, and the Joy of Love. The question about divorced and remarried Catholics has been a central theme, but it was debated in two synods. So collegiality and synodality, as they call it, is one of the ways he's touched the internal life of the church. That's a question of structure and relationship. Second way he touches the internal life of the church is not by structure, but by vision. Now, he constantly says that he is in continuity with his predecessors in the social teaching of the church. And that's true, But he's also in discontinuity. He has his own way of taking themes that have been taught before and specifying them in ways that catches the attention of the world. So the social teaching of the church over 100 years has had particular emphasis on social and economic justice, and that ought to be a measure by which we measure a country and measure the world. Francis takes the theme and gives it his own spin. He says the problem we've got today throughout the world is we've got an economy of exclusion, an economy of exclusion rather than inclusion. Based on that, he does his critique of the market. He doesn't say the market is bad, the market shouldn't exist. He says the market is being run in a way that it is not for the benefit of people. So he says the market can't be treated like a god. It needs to be shaped, it needs to be given policy and direction at the national and international level. So he changes structure, he develops a vision. Thirdly, there's the question of the poor. For him, as he became Archbishop of Buenos Aires, at least people who knew him then and who have written deeply about him say that it was his living contact with the poor, and there was plenty of them in Argentina, that shaped his ministry significantly. He wants to make sure the poor are not invisible inside a city, inside a country, inside the world. And so his style is to lift up the poor wherever he goes. Think about his visit to the United States. He goes to the White House for the state occasion, he and the president. That's fine. That happens all the time. And as you might guess, after the White House state occasion, there's a reception. Francis goes to the White House, exchanges greetings with the president. Everybody goes in for the reception. Francis goes down the street to Catholic Charities and has soup with homeless people. Instinctive gestures with substance behind them. But the larger picture is he wants to lift up the status of the poor in the world. He wants to argue that the poor are not simply recipients. Obviously, people in poverty do need outside help. But his point is the poor have other things to teach the rest of the world. Their faith is a gift to the rest of the world. Their creativity, how they survive on $1 a day or $2 a day, is a gift of creativity. And thirdly, that the objective of social justice is not only to deal with the material needs of the poor, but to put poor people in the place where they are agents rather than recipients, where they not only receive, but they give back, and their dignity is enhanced. Now, with that theme, lift up the status, show their faith and creativity, that theme, he addresses it at the UN, he addresses it when he came to the US, he constantly talks about it at the Vatican, and when he goes on his trips around the world, that that is a significant theme. Collegiality is about structure and relationship. The social teaching is about vision. The centrality of the poor is making it a principal objective of the life of the church. Finally, Francis's view of what the presence of the church in the world should be. Once again, he has a way of capturing things that people have said before, but not said in his way. So how does he describe the church? He says the church ought to be like a field hospital in a battlefield. He said the world has multiple conflicts. Those conflicts have done great harm to people. Conflicts within countries, conflicts between countries, conflicts within cities and towns. He said the church ought to be like a field hospital in a broken world. The church ought to stand at the intersection of human suffering. He calls it the existential peripheries. There's a line for you. Existential peripheries mean where people suffer in different ways, and people can suffer in different ways. It isn't only poor people who suffer. People can suffer in different ways. He wants a church sensitively pastoral so that it's able to stand at the peripheries where people suffer and offer various kinds of assistance. Secondly, he wants a church of mercy. You remember the year of mercy. The year of mercy will never be over. The purpose of having a year was once again to focus attention on a theme that he wants to permeate the life of the church. The idea is that we receive the mercy of God ourselves. We should be conscious of that. But we also should be conscious that having been touched by the mercy of God, we are to be agents of the mercy of God. And he stresses this again and again. He says, this happens in ordinary situations. Think of your daily existence and the opportunities we have to be agents of mercy. And he says a word here and there can do it. He offers these instinctive gestures, if you will, to demonstrate what it is that a church of mercy is about. So, justice in the church, mercy in the church, justice in the world, vision, structure, pastoral presence. Now, there are volumes that go with this of his own statements and his own actions, but you'll be happy to know I will not take you through volumes. So I want to turn to the question of Francis and the world. Francis as the Pope. So here I have to tell you how short-sighted I was. So giving talks on Francis is a cottage industry, and I've had more than my share. And when I first started out, one of the things I said, which I still believe, is that when you get elected to be Pope, the job is multi-dimensional. I always said to be Pope, you need to be a good pastor, a good administrator, and a good diplomat. So a good pastor, you have to have a quality of faith that is so deep and evident that other people's faith can grow from listening to you, watching you, and finding in their own life how they deal with justice, mercy, compassion. Good administrator. Benedict XVI was a wonderful theologian. We will read Benedict XVI in the church long after he was dead. He was not a good administrator. Not a good administrator. So by the time it came time to elect a pope, we had administrative problems of major proportions in the Vatican. And so you had to be a good administrator. Good pastor, good administrator. I thought Francis was excellently suited to be both of those. The third role is diplomat. You are a head of state as the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. You have ambassadors all over the world, over 150 countries. The Vatican has the only religious body that has that kind of structure. And you are expected to be a diplomat. Francis was not trained as a diplomat. John the 23rd was a diplomat, Paul the 6th was a diplomat, Pius the 12th was a diplomat. John Paul II was deeply involved in political questions in Poland. I just thought this is one probably that will not be a strong suit. So I had to change my mind as I watched him, as you watch him move through the world. So how does he function as he deals with the world? Well, first of all, there's the theme of, again, lifting things up that the world doesn't pay attention to. He talks about an economy of exclusion. He also talks about the fact that the world, at times, the world has grown to what he calls a world of indifference, that we get used to the tragedies of the world. They don't strike us as much. Does a 24-hour news cycle help us or hurt us? I think the cycle helps us, that we can be aware, but it also can deaden our sense. So he was saying he was going to lift up parts of the world that usually got ignored. He does it in two ways. First, by the cardinals he appoints. He has appointed cardinals to places that have never had a cardinal before. Appointed to tiny Myanmar has a cardinal. Albania has a cardinal. Albania is not at the center of attention of the National Security Council, in case you're wondering, nor is Myanmar, for that matter. So what he does is he lifts up cardinals from places that the church didn't have on its main agenda. But he also makes trips on that basis. Now, he goes to the standard places, like the United States, or like countries in Europe. But he goes to places that the Pope has not gone to. Now, no one went to more places than John Paul II, no question about that. But even there, Francis chooses new places to go to. So it is an attempt to lift the geography of the life of the church before the world. Then, beyond simply doing that, Francis has chosen 4 transnational issues as his themes of dealing with diplomacy and the social teaching of the church. And those 4 themes are inequality within nations and among nations. Secondly, the environment. Thirdly, immigration. And fourthly, war and peace. Now, I said all 4 of those are transnational issues. Again, that's a kind of technical term that political scientists use. A transnational issue is the kind of issue that cuts across national borders. So it's a little different than how one state deals with another. One state deals with another as 2 territorial units. There are boundaries. You may structure your economy one way, I structure my economy another, etc. Transnational issues are of such a character that no single nation can solve them, and every nation in some form is touched by them. So think about inequality, environment, immigration, war and peace. These are issues that cut across the nations of our time. No single nation can resolve them, and everybody, to some degree, is touched by them. Now, one of the things about the church is a transnational actor. What's a transnational actor? Transnational actor is an organization that is based in one place, present in several places, have a trained corps of personnel, and a single guiding philosophy. That's IBM, Phillips Petroleum, the World Bank, and the Jesuits. All of them are transnational actors. All of them are transnational actors. The church is a transnational actor. The first major book that was written on modern transnational actors had a chapter on the economy, a chapter on politics, a chapter on science, and a chapter on the Roman Catholic Church. So people have recognized this for a long time. So you've got a transnational actor working on 4 major transnational issues. So how does he deal with them? This is very selective. Inequality. It exists everywhere. We think of inequality in countries in Africa. We think of inequality in countries in Latin America, but inequality in the United States is real. It's not just real in the cities, it's real in rural America, and it's real in the macro analysis of American economic life. The percentage where wealth is confined, and it's not like one is trying to say everybody ought to be everything, everybody ought to be exactly the same. You don't run an economy that way. But you don't have to run an economy with the degree of inequality that exists in the United States. And if we've got it here, you can imagine what it means in places that have less capability of addressing it than we do. So inequality requires both charity and justice. That's part of Francis's theme. The way we address inequality through charity is when we give money to organizations. We make a decision about how much money we will give. It's about charity. Justice is about how you structure an economy and a country so there's a fairer distribution of wealth. Not equality, but not what we've got now. That takes you into tax policy, takes you into fiscal policy, takes you into how major institutions in a country are structured and how major institutions in the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, investment policy, how those are shaped. Francis says the economy ought to be at the service of the person. In an economy of exclusion, the person is often subject to the law of the market. Question about how to do that, huge question, but that's his theme. Secondly, the environment. He's produced two major documents, the Joy of the Gospel, and then the document that's entitled Laudato Si. Now, Laudato Si is another good instance of how he grabs a symbolic thing. Laudato Si is a hymn that his patron, Francis of Assisi, sang to the cosmos, sang to the sun and the earth. Praise be you, Lord, creator of these things. So that's the way he entitles the environmental letter. The environmental letter is a highly complex document. That's good. It's a highly complex issue. You can't get away with simple statements. It is a classical transnational issue. If you have the cleanest environment in the world and your neighbor has got a dirty environment, you've got a dirty environment. That's simple to understand, hard to get at. So he produced this letter from the beginning of his pontificate. He was interested in this question. But he produced a letter that, in the midst of vast amount of analysis and writing on this topic, his letter stands out. Why does it stand out? First of all, because he ties this macro issue of environment, which touches every social class, every group in a country and among countries. He ties environment to poverty, once again. He wants to know the impact of the environment on the world, and he wants to know the impact of environment, particularly on the poor individuals and poor countries. The reaction to that letter was extraordinary, just extraordinary. Here are some quotes, just to give you a sense. The London Guardian. This is a newspaper on the left of the political spectrum. They are not used to reading encyclicals, believe me. The Guardian is not getting up in the morning singing the Magnificat. And so listen to what the Guardian said about his letter on the economy. Quote, the most astonishing and perhaps the most ambitious papal document of the past 100 years. Their judgment. A colleague of mine at Harvard, whom I actually don't know because she's in another section of the university, Professor Naomi Oreskes. I just don't know her, haven't met her yet. But she's a professor of the historian of science at Harvard. And one of the English publishing companies got her to write the introduction to Francis's letter. I have no idea whether she's Catholic or not, but this is what she said about the letter. She began by saying, history tells us when we've been through historic times, But people living through historical times sometimes have a hard time recognizing a historical moment. So then she goes on to say the following. Sometimes, she says, sometimes, however, a book catalyzes thought into action. Uncle Tom's Cabin did this, and so did Silent Spring. Like these works, Pope Francis's encyclical is a call to action that insists we embrace the moral dimensions of problems that have heretofore been viewed as scientific, technological, and economic, end quote. The environment is scientific, technological, and economics, and you need to know those things to speak intelligently. But to say the environment is moral gives a different edge to the question. It isn't just about the numbers. It's about the moral stakes of people's lives being affected in this generation and far beyond it. So the reaction to the letter was extraordinary. Its reception and significance. So he drove a stake into the ground. This pontificate will always be known in light of that letter, just as John the 23rd was known in light of peace on earth. Thirdly, immigration, words and deeds, the visit to Lampedusa, the visit to the other isle, the visit to the Jesuit Refugee Center. And then the visits are matched by words. He speaks on behalf of millions. Migration is a classical transnational issue. Now, migration has been with us as old as recorded history. The Exodus in the Old Testament is about migration. But we live at a different time in history. We live at a time of what is called, empirically, a globalized world, a globalized world. In a globalized world, goods move, ideas move, money moves, and people move. And so this ancient topic exists in a very different setting. People move now by the millions. Now it is a fractured global world. And so why do people move? They move first because of internal conflict. Syria. When war is going on and you are told you can't even stay in your neighborhood or you'll be killed, you move. There is transnational conflict. ISIS. Transnational groups are not all like Guardian of Angels. Transnational groups carry guns and bombs and do harm. Thirdly, immigration's consequences come from internal conflict, transnational conflict, but immigration also comes not only from a search for survival, but because of hope. People move because they hope they can enhance the life they have and the life of their children. Now, complicated issue. The equation that makes up the immigration issue, there's questions of security and sovereignty. Those aren't bad things. If they're everything, then you get into the spot we're in now, where people trump security and sovereignty over against considerations of obligations to people who are moving because of survival, safety, and dreams. And so the equation is not only security and sovereignty, it's also compassion and clarity. It's also creativity about how to respond. He doesn't want chaos. He said you have to pace immigration into a country. But pacing it is different than cutting it in half, which we do with refugees now. Take half as many refugees in this kind of world as we used to take. So it then leads to the consequences of what we're dealing with. 11 million undocumented people. 11 million people. There's got to be some creative answer to that. Expelling 11 million people will make us historic in the wrong sense and probably impossible. DACA. kids that were brought here as infants have known no other place to live, are now threatened with being run out of the country. Temporary protective status, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua. Countries where our bishops' conference sent delegations to talk to the church and the government and say, can you receive these people home? There's no capacity there. So it's recognizing the significance of the moment is that he's talking about. War and peace. We live in a world that is unlike the Cold War, that could produce one kind of war, interstate warfare, threatened by nuclear weapons, huge. The world we live in today produces three kinds of war. First of all, interstate war is still possible. India, Pakistan, the Middle East. Secondly, there's internal war, war within countries that drives the immigration question. Thirdly, there is transnational terror. So when you think about war and peace, it's not one issue. The danger of the nuclear question has declined from the high point of the Cold War, but it's not over. But now it's complemented by others. And so Francis has tried to do his part to reduce the degree of violence. The main thing he does is to plead for religion not being a source of war. Religion not being a source of war. It has been in the past. It can be now. But he has tried to bend the arc of religious interaction away from it. Secondly, he thinks the church should be involved in the work of peace building. He tries to do that. That was what the trip to Myanmar was about. Could you come in from outside as a minority voice and make a difference? He goes to other places where there are internal conflicts, and but he wants the church as a community in different places and in different ways with different responsibilities to be involved in the work of peace building. And on the nuclear issue, he has joined with others, some of the most experienced diplomats in this country, who have said on the nuclear issue, it hasn't gone away and we may be reaching a tipping point. That's what Henry Kissinger said. That's what George Shultz said. That's what Bill Perry said. That's what Sam Nunn said. We may be facing a tipping point where nuclear weapons can just spread throughout the world. Francis is arguing going to zero. It's a complicated question. To be honest, as he argues that question, I'm not sure I'm convinced of every step along the way, but there's no doubt about the significance of putting the Pope behind that question. Final point. He has a sense for the big issues, immigration, environment. And it looks like there's one more big issue that is both internal and external to the church, and that's China. It is clear the Vatican is now in serious conversation with the government of the People's Republic of China to try to change the situation between Catholicism and that government that has been in place since 1949. And we know it's been a persecuted church. And there's an underground church and an above-ground church. The underground church are people who have been persecuted. The above ground is where the government has okayed some active presence, but there are huge disputes about how bishops are named. And for the Catholic Church, that's central. It is clear he is reaching for a grand bargain of the Catholic Church and China. He's already said he wants to go there. I'm sure John Paul II wanted to go there. But there is on the horizon the possibility that this pontificate would bring that about, a sense for the big issues. So that's where he's been, that's what he's about. He's complicated. He has invited debate about all the issues he talks about, and all of us are debating. Because he's dealing with such large issues, you can totally agree with the objective and disagree about the means. But it's all about shaping a church that is both a source of justice and a source of mercy. And for that, this is a pontificate that blesses our time. Thank you very much.
I forgot to tell them about the note cards. I'm just going to have them ask you the questions, if that's okay.
I'm sorry?
I'm just going to have them ask you the questions directly, if that's okay.
Okay, that's all right with me.
All right.
Just keep our eye on the time. That's
Yes, yes, we have to keep our eye on the time. Ryan, are we okay? We're going to be okay? Good. Ryan is going to drive, Brian to the airport, and I've had him check like on the TSA lines and everything, so that's...
And we're going to obey the speed limit, too. That's...
Not if I was driving. But anyway, so we were going to have you like fill out cards, but since I didn't tell you to do that, we have two microphones here, so you have a chance to ask a question, but I'm going to trust you, but this means no filibusters. Your questions are not a chance to give your view of the Catholic Church for 5 minutes. So I want like 2, 3 sentences maybe, and that's it. Can we all agree on that? Yeah. Class? We've all agreed on that. You go beyond that, I don't know what I'm going to do. If I had a trap door, I'd open it. But I trust this. We have great audiences. I told Brian that we do have great audiences. So let's come on forward and we'll start taking our questions. If you would come to the microphones.
Just line up.
Is the status of women a transnational issue not being addressed?
Yes. The answer is yes. It's a transnational issue not being addressed in society, and it's a transnational issue that we haven't done nearly enough on the church. When you're half of the human race, you're a transnational actor. So,
Can I have a follow-up? What would you do?
well, that's a complicated question, what we should do, because it's multidimensional. It is multidimensional. There are obviously questions that people focus on, like access to office in the church, and that's a real question. I mean, the difficulty is if you go to the hardest question of all on that, like ordaining women, you run up against pretty strong opposition from several repeated papal and doctrinals. Take ordination off the counter and almost anything else is open. You conceivably could have women ambassadors in the Vatican diplomatic corps. Now, the first step to that is having lay people accepted as ambassadors, which they're not. There are lay people who work in the various parts of Vatican diplomacy. But you could do that. In the United States, without a great deal of fanfare, women now hold a number of senior administrative positions across the country. Women chancellors, women in the marriage courts, women in the financial area of the church, women training pastoral ministry. So there's a lot, but there's a lot that's not done, and it could and should make a difference. He has talked about that. He has not talked a lot about it, but he has talked about trying to deal with that.
What do you think the chances of getting women deacons are?
Well, I'm out of my depth, to be very honest, because that's a theological question, and I spend my life talking about whether people kill each other or how we try and stop you from killing each other. When you lecture on Iran and nuclear weapons, they don't usually ask you if women can be deacons. It doesn't go along with my game plan. But he's got a commission studying it. He's got some interesting people on the commission. I don't know enough about the issue. It sounds to me like it's doable, but I'm out of my depth.
I heard you say that the Pope Francis doesn't believe the market is working properly, and I wonder about. I'm a capitalist myself. I believe in the capitalistic system. I've benefited from it, but I wonder. I think a lot of people believe that he's more inclined to socialism. I appreciate your opinions about that.
He has not been friendly to socialism. I think this is where coming from Latin America makes a lot of difference. he has seen markets, global and national, that seem to run without restriction, without guidance. The market is a means to an end. I think economists agree on that. The market's a means to an end. If it's a means to an end, then it is not self-perpetuating to every goal it must meet. So somebody can say the market is efficient. Let's presume it's efficient. Efficient does not necessarily mean just. So you can be efficient and not be just. So then the question becomes, if the market is not autonomous, then how do you deal with it? And usually it's dealt with in terms of policy framework. What's the vision that guides the policy framework? That's what he's concerned about. He's, again, concerned about not only how it affects everyone, but he's particularly concerned about how it affects those who are in the most vulnerable positions. Why don't I go here and then come back there?
Father, the Joy of Love Exhortation, which you mentioned earlier, is a wonderful document, and it includes a rather controversial footnote, which has led to a very public dispute challenging the Pope's standing on redemption of those who have left their marriages for a variety of reasons,
Right.
and want to come back. How will this be resolved?
Well, you've got the right question, wrong document. It's not the joy of the gospel. It's
Joy of Love.
It's the joy of love, yeah. The debate is about how you interpret past teaching. How will it be resolved? Well, theological discussion gets resolved in the church by what I'd call structured dialogue and pastoral practice. So it's a mix of both how the church acts and how you conduct a debate when there is a debate. He has invited debate on his topic. He's invited debate on that topic, and he's gotten it. Now, he's gotten it in some unusual ways at times. There were 4 cardinals who protested about the whole thing. You know, that we can live with that. I mean, debate in the Catholic Church is a good thing because what we believe is that faith complements reason. We do not believe literalist, simply the answer jumps off the page of the Bible. The answer is rooted in the vision in the Bible, but you have to make sense of it through the use of reason. So we're going to have structured debate. The other thing seems to be that what he's saying is, you know, we have a rule about not entering into a second marriage unless the first marriage is ended either by death or annulled. He says that, but he is concerned that while that rule is valid, it doesn't necessarily touch everybody's lives the way it should. It isn't sufficiently encompassing. So he says, basically, if you find yourself in that position, you should sit down and talk with a priest you can trust and see if there's any running room that can be made either through the courts or through theological judgments. And so he's asking for an open debate, and he's asking for good pastoral practice. So he's asking priests to exercise the virtue of prudence within a structured framework, which is a very Catholic way, but he's pushed the envelope on this. There is no question about it. He has pushed the envelope on this. What he has not done is sort of trash the teaching. And the teaching may well be open to further refinement from both pastoral practice and structured debate.
Hi, Father Bryan. It's great to have you here. Thanks for coming. I'm fascinated by this notion of instinctive, which you used a few times, that word, more than a few times. Instinctive.
Instinct, yeah, right.
Yes, and so from a sociological standpoint, Weber, of course, does not address instinctive. And the church is also a little bit uncomfortable with that notion of instinctive, it seems like. The word that we use, at least since Augustine and Aquinas both, is maybe intuition.
Yeah.
But instinctive is very interesting, and I'm wondering if you could reflect for us on how you're using that in the context
Maybe you
of
shouldn't tell
procreation.
everybody I said it. But I think it's true. Instinctive, think of an athlete. Think of an athlete. You watch, on Sunday afternoons, we watch these highly talented wideout ends. You know, they have a way of not only running the pattern, but running the pattern in a way that they get an extra step. You don't, as coaches say, you don't coach that, it's born in people, that kind of. That's a little bit like instinctive action. People have a sense of grasping a moment, seeing a moment, and responding to it. Now, again, no wide-out end is going to trash Bill Belichick's game plan. So I mean, the point is, instinctive action doesn't mean chaos, but it does mean that you respond to a situation instinctively. Then you need to think about the response and seeing if you learn something from the instinctive action and can make rational planning out of it.
Hi. So I'm wondering, when we talk about these 4 transnational issues that the Pope has spoken and acted about, what are the implications for us in the pews on these 4 transnational issues?
What am I looking for?
What are the implications for us in the pews?
Well, let's look at them and think of them. Think of American society. That's where we are. So, is inequality an issue? I think it is. Demonstrable issue. When we think about tax policy, when we think about fiscal policy, when we think about social safety net, where is the voice of the voters? Politicians are moved more by voters than they are by charter. So I read in the paper this morning that there's a proposal to cut out the heating assistance for poor families. Is that a good thing? I've been associated with Catholic Charities at different levels in Boston, where, as many of you know, we don't have a rather balmy climate. What happens is we run out of housing assistance money before the first of the year, every year. Before the first of the year. So that means you've got January, February, and March to get them. So if you're going to cut out government assistance for the housing, is that an issue that somebody could pick up the phone and call their congressman about it? And, you know, when I worked in Washington once, I remember once we were dealing with a foreign policy issue, and a senator's aide called me and said, we got 13 calls on this issue today. He said, 13 calls for us is a crisis. I mean, inequality. Immigration. Immigration is a tough policy issue, but immigration is also about how people are welcomed into a community. Immigration is about what people do when someone says we're going to settle Syria here. How's that received? How do people respond? I think people respond very well. I think people in the pews respond better than the political system is responding to that. And that's probably tribute to our culture in the United States that's better than its politics at the present minute. You should think of that. The environment. I mean, this has not been a specialty of mine, but I understand there are literally scores of things we can do in daily affairs, and we are doing them. I mean, you never had green receptacles and blue receptacles out when the town picked up the rubbish in my town. Well, we take that for granted now. Businesses are way ahead of the government, way ahead of the government on environmental policy. So and not only businesses, but communities. So on a lot of these transnational issues, there are big policy issues, but there are concrete personal ways of dealing with them.
We got a question up here in the back from Matt Cavadon. He got a JD and a Master's of Theology here, Brian.
That's a tough
so
combination.
This is
Go
the
right
last
ahead.
question, so bring it home, Matt.
How come reform efforts around child abuse seem to have stalled between the problems at the Vatican panels, between the comments in Chile a few weeks ago? Is that an administrative problem, or why is there such difficulty?
Yeah, right. So this issue is, I come from Boston. That's called ground zero. Ground zero. The first thing you know about when you deal with it, first thing you know about is this is going to take generations to fix. Generations to fix. Not generations to decide good rules, good practice, and implement the practice. But it's going to take generations to fix. That the major casualty of the sexual abuse crisis was what happened to kids. then happen to their family. So that's the major crisis. The secondary crisis of this issue is the loss of trust in the Catholic Church. That's what the secondary is. That's what I mean, generations deficient. And we lost trust on two levels. We lost trust in terms of people in the pews. Presumption was you could trust the church. Lost trust in the wider society. I've worked in the public arena for the church for 45 years. Dealt with other organizations, secular, other religious. The presumption always was the church was an agency you could trust, was trustworthy, and you could work. Now, we may have made some steps, but I'll tell you that what happened with the sexual abuse crisis is the presumption shifted from presumptive trust to presumptive doubt about the credibility and trustworthiness of the church. That takes generations to win back. So what you've got to do is have high profile, whether it's commissions or, Boston, we have set up training programs for every single person who deals with a child. Any volunteer in a parish has to be quartered every year. Something in our schools, in our religious education programs, it's going to take money. It has taken money. But those are coercive things for the court. We then have to spend, we spend millions now in having lifetime care for people who need it. That's all simply remedial. The trust issue is future oriented. Now, the Holy Father, I think, finds this issue really tough. I think he does. Not everybody has great instincts on every single problem that makes up one's job. And I think he, at times, finds it tough to deal with. But my cardinal is very close to him. And he says, I have been in the room when he's met with victims. I have seen the impact on him. That's not to say that what I said in prison was okay. It wasn't. But I think it was inexperience in dealing with this issue. And then he did make public that he, in fact, now meets with victims weekly and monthly. That has a transformative effect. So we need rules, we need best practices, we need to pay the money we need to pay, we need to take care of people and their families, and we need to rebuild trust within the church and in the wider society. And it is a generational question. I say that not to be discouraging, but just because we can have an accurate definition of how big this question is and how we can't take our eye off the ball.
Okay, with that, thank you.